per student for in the schools if the end result is no better than if they had never come. I mean, that's how bad in some places like Detroit education has become. Some people say, well, it's class size. The smaller the class, the better the student performance. And there's a slight correlation there, but it's not as strong as people think. The one ingredient that connects with student performance more than any other is parental involvement, involving the parents. And I'm not talking about a system where, the parents come to meetings and they have to sit through boring meetings and the school board lectures at them and then the parents make an objection and the school board dismisses them. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about where they're personally involved, they help the students with their homework, they can choose the school they go to. The more choice you tend to give people, the more attention they tend to give to that issue. In fact, it's an odd thing that in places like the United States, you have people who spend more time choosing what car they're going to buy than what school their children will attend. And in almost every case, it's because when it comes to the school, there's no choice. Unless you have a high income and can opt out of the system, you have to go to the government school you've been assigned to. So you pay little attention to it. So parents seem uninterested, but it's more because of the disincentives than it is for any other reason. The fourth principle that I mentioned is choice and competition are necessary preconditions to school improvement. Every education reform idea, and there have been a lot of them, I'm sure here in Romania too, lots of proposals, ideas for improvement, they all fall into one of three categories. Every reform. One, rules. Two, resources. Three, incentives. Let's take a look at those briefly. Every reform is it falls into one of those categories. Rules, resources, or incentives. This one, the rules category, that means, people who say, education's bad, we need to fix it. So let's issue more rules, more mandates. Let's have more studies. Let's tell the teachers what they have to do. Let's devise their curriculum for them. Let's issue penalties and commands. So this is the top-down central planning, just by decree we can make education better. Believe me, in the United States at least, we have tried this. At the state level, at the federal level, at the local level, people see problems and they have traditionally applied new rules, new mandates, new requirements, penalties, until finally the system is so rigid, so top-down, that the people who are actually supposed to do the educating, the teachers, feel as though they have no room. They're told what to do. They can't be creative. In America, at least, we have exhausted the rules approach. There is no more room for more rules, I think, in America. We've tried that. And the result is test scores are not getting any better. The second category of reform is resources. This is where people say, we just need to spend more. We just need brighter classrooms and fancier buildings and swimming pools or whatever it takes. Believe me, in Kansas City, Missouri, about 15 years ago, the schools were so bad that a judge ruled that, the problem is they're not spending enough in Kansas City. And he ordered the state to triple the spending in Kansas City. Guess what happened 10 years later? Do you think the schools they had big swimming pools, they built a lot of new schools, but do you think the student outcomes were any better? 10 years later, after all this spending, the schools were regarded as so bad that the state had to take them over. So we got nothing for all that money. That's a particular example, extreme example, but in America we have exhausted resources as a reform tool as well. Real, after inflation spending on education in America is up by more than double in the last 15 years, and yet test scores have gone no place. The third category of reform is, I think, the most promising, and that is the category of incentives. This observes that people are creatures of incentives and disincentives. And don't you see that in our daily behavior? We tend to do more of those things that we have opportunities for reward in, those things in which we get penalized, we do less of. And so if you want to get better education, I think we need to be thinking more in terms of how can we improve the incentives so that teachers get rewards when they do well. So that schools do better when they save money and produce better outcomes instead of just adding to the staffing. The category of incentives, I think, offers the greatest opportunity for reform. Can you imagine, let's take an extreme example. Let's suppose we decided, no, resources and rules are the way to go. Let's have a top-down, centrally planned, mandated, rule-driven, bureaucratic-heavy educational system that will make things happen. Like they used to say, Mussolini, he made trains run on time. You ever hear that phrase? Mussolini made sure the trains ran on time. They really didn't run on time, by the way, but there was that feeling that because he commanded it, the trains ran on time. The most extreme top-down education system would look like this. You'd have, everyone would have to attend a government school, and they would have to attend the government school that they were assigned to, not a different one. They couldn't choose between government schools. All the food that was served to the students would have to be produced on collective farms and sold through government grocery stores. All the books would have to be produced in government book factories by government authors. I mean, most people in the world today would say, that's ridiculous. Where would be the incentive for improvement? All you would do is reward the system at the expense of the students. Parents have to be able to say, and this is what I mean by choice and competition, they have to be able to say, no thanks, I don't like what you're doing here, I can go over here. In the absence of that opportunity, you simply have a system of disincentives for improvement. If you have captives instead of customers, you must expect lousy results. How many of you here think that the state loves your children more than you do? And yet everywhere you hear people express skepticism about allowing more freedom for parents. Oh, they might not know what to do, they might make silly choices. You know. Well, who is the state but other parents? You know, is there something about being a government employee that suddenly makes you more caring of someone else's children? It's absurd. The more choice and opportunity you give to parents, the more interested they become in those things, in better schools in this case. And finally, one size does not fit all. Children are not all the same. The methods of delivery of education are not the same. We should be thinking in broad terms of encouraging the greatest flowering of different options. Some might fail, but it's through failure that we learn. It's through choice that we create incentives for improvement. We cannot be afraid of failure. As long as the system is responsive through choice and accountability, failure can be a great teacher. You know, in the United States, you still have people who say, oh, we can't allow more private educational options because maybe there'd be a school somewhere that wouldn't do a good job. And so out of fear that that could happen, what do? We continue to press children into schools where they're falling through the cracks by the millions in places like Detroit. In the U.S., in the last 20 years, I'm happy to say there has been movement. It's been tough, slow, there's still lots of room for improvement, but there has been movement in the areas, in the directions that I'm talking about here. And it's come in several forms. I'll work this to a conclusion so we can get to some questions, but in the process of concluding here, I want to suggest some of the options that might be available in Romania and in many other places as well. And I'll do that by telling you some of the things we've begin to experiment with in the United States. 25 years ago, we pretty much had one option for parents, and that was the government school they were assigned to locally. There were private schools, but few in number. There wasn't much homeschooling 25, 30 years ago. We had pretty much the assignment system. You live here, you go to school here. Okay? Well, there was a growing consensus that that was not conducive to improvement in education. So the movement for things like choice and accountability, opportunity, really has gathered steam in America. So now we have choice in many places among government schools. The situation I described for you earlier about the parents who wanted to send their gifted child to the other school, that can't happen now in most places in America. If a child wants to go to a different government school, he can go, and usually the money will follow the child. So that problem has, in most places in the U.S., been largely fixed. That's an improvement. That's a little more choice. That's more focus on the kids, less on the system. And now we have charter schools. How many of you have heard of charter schools in the U.S.? Charter schools are still public schools, but they are substantially deregulated. And I'll give you an example of the state of Michigan, where I lived for 33 years before moving to Georgia last year. In the state of Michigan, in 1999, the legislature passed the first charter school law in Michigan. And what it did was, it said the universities and the local government school districts can create new schools. And if they do, they can have their own board of directors, drawn from the public. They don't have to be elected, which is silly. You know, you go into elections to vote for people you never heard of, to run a school. It seems so inefficient. But with charter schools, they can be independent. Certain regulations follow, but much less than with traditional government schools. Well, what has happened? Local government schools don't start new ones this way. They almost never create charter schools. But the universities in Michigan have done it by the hundreds. One university, Central Michigan University, has created 150 charter schools for first grade through 12th grade around the state of Michigan. Many of them in the inner city. These are substantially deregulated schools. Guess what's happened in the inner city in places like Detroit, where for so long parents were dismissed as, they don't care. You know, every charter school has a long waiting list of parents who want to send their children there. But there's a cap on how many charter schools we can have. That needs to be changed. But anyway, they all have waiting lists. So parents who say, here's an option, here's a choice, it's a better school. I want to send my child there. They're all packed, and they all have a waiting list. Parents who seem to be uninterested suddenly have an interest when they have options, when they have the opportunity for choice. We have private schools. They're growing in number in some states. But the most significant change in American education, I think, of the last 20 years has come in homeschooling. This is one of the most exciting options in education reform. 20 years ago, homeschooling, the idea that parents who themselves were not teachers could somehow educate their own children, was not widely accepted. Some states even made it illegal altogether. But now it's legal in every state, and in some states the freedom to do this is vast, it's enormous, and it's growing by leaps and bounds. What would you expect to find among homeschool students and their test scores? Are they higher or lower?
Higher.
Higher.
Yeah,